Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. The Seattle Public School District says activities requiring students to provide information protected by state and federal law don't violate the statutes as long as teachers don't store the information without parental consent. Joining me is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, the activity under scrutiny here is a social identity wheel. Can you tell us what is a social identity wheel?
Yeah, Eliana, it's a great question. I was not familiar with these before I started reporting on them, I believe in February. I think it's been around for a while in just different discussions about equity and privilege. So the one of them is called a social identity wheel. Another name is like a privilege wheel. And essentially I have like a handout pulled up here. It's like basically trying to find different indicators or drivers of privilege, like the demographic characteristics, right? So, the assumption there is that those demographic characteristics are associated with privilege. So, depending on if you have them or not, or like those affect your privilege or your status. So, essentially, like a handout so this was the Seattle Public School District. The administration handed out to principals to distribute to teachers a Black Lives Matter School presentation. And that included these social identity wheels or the privilege wheels. And that was for the Black Lives Matter School week, which I wrote about in February. But this is one of those activities. And so this is the exact activity that was handed out to students in that presentation, in that PowerPoint with the list of different curriculum materials. So essentially, it asks students to review the terminology and definitions. And in the outer circle, you can color the wheel, so where your demographics align with the most privileged group, and then place a star next to categories where you think the reality is complicated. So it's reflect on how your privilege in this area manifests for you. So then, you have to try to reflect on draw a green color if you've used that privilege in ways that have positively impacted the community, yellow if you've had a neutral impact, and red if you've used that privilege in ways that have negatively impacted the community. And then leave it white if you don't know or haven't thought about it. And so then these different demographic characteristics are like citizenship status, or race or ethnicity, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, household income or class, educational attainment, gender identity, political affiliation, disability status, or age. So those are all of the ones on this wheel. It's got different spokes, and then and it's kind of going to those different demographic characteristics, right? And then on that particular handout too, it has a lot of definitions about those things. So for example, political affiliation is one's association with a political party or faction. Religious affiliation, religion is an institutionalized personal system of beliefs and practices. So, and it goes through all those different, kinds of things that it brings up. That is the sort of the heart of those handouts. And there's a different variety. Some of those are a little bit more intense. Some of those are a little bit less intense. So they might ask students to do different kinds of things. But essentially, it's to reflect on these specific characteristics.
And so then how could this run up against certain federal and state laws?
Essentially, what federal law prohibits, it prohibits schools that receive federal money from asking about political affiliation, mental or psychological problems, sex behavior attitudes, different kinds of illegal, antisocial, self-incriminating, or demeaning behavior, legally recognized privilege, or not. So that'd be with your lawyer. Most students probably don't have a lawyer. Religious practices, affiliations, or beliefs, and income. So as I mentioned before in the handout, there's some of those demographic characteristics that are in that there. So specifically, the federal law says no student shall be required as part of any applicable program, like federally funded school district, to submit to a survey, analysis, or evaluation that reveals that kind of information without the prior consent of the student, if the student is an emancipated minor, or in the case of an unemancipated minor, without the prior written consent of the parent. So essentially, you can't ask students about these things without parental consent. And in Washington, about your question about the state statute, the Washington Administrative Code, there's a prohibition against asking students about religious affiliation. So no written or oral test, questionnaire, survey, or examination shall be used to elicit the personal beliefs or practices of a student or his parents as to religion, except with the written consent of parent or guardian. So that's pretty clear, right? You can't ask students about this unless a parent signs off on it. So a parent raised that to the school district and said, hey, look, this is what the law says. This is what, state law says. And essentially the school district in determining whether or not that violated the law, then these are different administrators on a instructional review committee that I think was just a couple of administrators, and they can sort of meet as they need to determine these things. They basically said this doesn't violate the federal law, and I think they probably argue the same thing with the state law, as long as teachers don't collect the information. So as soon as they do that, it's like a survey, or it's like, we're collecting this for the information gathering purposes. And so that's what they say is the way kind of around that, and saying so they're going to instruct teachers not to collect this kind of information. Now, so that's the thing, is if a teacher does not listen to that, or, and says, okay, I need you to turn in your work, or I need you to turn this in as homework, then they're violating the law. So the school is pretty clear about what that means. And I think it's harder to tell in the law. And, this might come down to, does a court have to decide this? You could argue that this is against the spirit of the federal law, even if they're not collecting the information. So I think, and again, like, nobody has done that, but I think it could be argued in court that, like, this is potentially could be in violation of that in some context, or, if a teacher gets it wrong. So if you're a teacher and you're working with these identity wheels in Seattle public schools, I would be very concerned just about where that information ends up, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely raises kind of an interesting question and sort of a gray area, because, I mean, maybe the teacher doesn't collect it, but maybe the teacher looks at it to help someone work on it. Or maybe a student is like kind of uncomfortable and not finishing the assignment, and they're kind of being pressured to finish the assignment because, like, well, it's still an assignment. And it kind of creates that gray area of, like, you're still making people reveal this information, even if it's not being stored or collected. And so it'll be interesting to see if this, like, turns into a court case later down the road. Yeah,
and if not in Seattle, then maybe somewhere else, because Seattle's not the only place that's using these kinds of social identity wheels and privilege wheels and that kind of thing. So I think that there's other school districts that are doing this, and we'll just kind of have to see what happens if concerned parents are speaking up and saying, I think you need to ask my permission before you give this to my student. If this is going to pop up in other areas too. Well, thank you for your insights on this story, Brendan. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.